That's good.
Okay, so I am going to go ahead and share my screen and actually turn off my camera because I wave my hands all around when I talk, which can be annoying. All right, so let me share my screen. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see this. And I'm going to minimize this over here, get this out of my way. Okay, so welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I think most of you know me, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Deb Schmidle. I'm a member of Love Living at Home, and I have an academic background in 16th and 17th century English history. And this is part of an ongoing series that I've been doing for Love Living at Home. So if you were here last month, you know that we talked about Charles I and Charles II. And this month we're picking up with the remaining Stuart dynasty. So James II, William and Mary, who you see in the center here, and then finishing up with Queen Anne. Now, I'm just going to give a 2-second summary, a little bit of what we talked about last month, either to catch you up, refresh your memories. If you did not come to that talk and you're interested in getting more background on the earlier Stuarts, Love Living at Home does record all these sessions and they put them on their YouTube channel, so you can find them there. So as I said last month, how did the Stuarts come to the English throne? Well, when the last Tudor monarch died, Elizabeth I, she was unwed, she had no children, hence her nickname, the Virgin Queen, and she was succeeded by James VI of Scotland. He was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII, and he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. So he came to the throne after Elizabeth died. After James died, he was succeeded by his son, Charles I, who, as you recall, ran into a little problem with Parliament and other issues in his government, and ended up losing his head, which led to an interregnum period of about 11 years when there was no monarch on the throne. And then Charles II, who had been in exile in Europe, came back, was invited back, and that was the Restoration. He became king. Charles had many illegitimate children, many mistresses, but he didn't have any legitimate heirs. So when we left it last time, Charles had died and he was being succeeded by his brother, James II, because he had no legitimate heirs of his own. So that's where we're going to start today. So James II, he was born in October of 1633. He was the second surviving son of Charles I. And like most of his siblings, he spent his formative years in exile in Europe during the English Civil Wars. Now, while he was in France, he served in 4 campaigns with the armies of Louis XIV. But then when his brother was, when they had the Restoration and his brother was invited back and he came to the throne as Charles II, James, who by then was known as the Duke of York, he became the Lord High Admiral, and he commanded the Royal Navy between 1660 and 1673. In 1664, he seized what was then New Amsterdam from the Dutch in the American colonies, what we now know as New York. They renamed it New York for the Duke of York. And so he had a lot of military experience. He had a prominent role at court, in his brother's court. And his brother even put him in charge of overseeing operations during the Great Fire of London in 1666, which you've heard me talk about before. So he was a pretty popular figure, lots of military history. Married twice, the first time in September of 1660 to Anne Hyde. You see him here with Anne Hyde and their 2 daughters. They had 8 children in all, but 6 died in childhood. So the only 2 surviving were these 2 daughters here, both of whom would go on to become reigning monarchs, and we're going to talk about them. James's marriage to Anne was somewhat controversial because she was 7 months pregnant at the time of their wedding. Her family really didn't want them to marry, but they did marry. And her father was also the Lord Chancellor for Charles II. So there was some concern in the government that this was going to give her father undue power in the government because his daughter was married to the brother of the king. Now, despite his marriage, James, like his brother and his, had many, many mistresses and many illegitimate children, but only these two daughters at this point. Now, at some time in the 1660s, and historians think it may have been around 1668, 1669, James secretly converted to Catholicism, but he kept it on the QT. He was quiet about it. He maintained his outward conformity to the Church of England. And his wife converted around the same time. And some say, well, she's the one that led him astray to become a Catholic, but that there's no real hard proof of that. And there was already Catholicism rolling through the family, through the Stuarts, off and on at this point. But they did convert. And in light of the fact, and he kept this quiet for a long time, but in 1673, Parliament issued something called the Test Acts. And basically this required any office holders to prove that they were not Catholics. So they had to make a declaration proving that they weren't Catholics, saying during the Holy Eucharist, during communion, the bread and wine are symbolic. They are not the body. They do not become the body and blood of Christ, which is what Roman Catholics believed. At this point, and remember, if you remember the earlier talks, all this started rolling out, this Catholic Protestant thing, when Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome way back in the 1530s, because he wanted to divorce his first wife and marry his second wife. So this off again, on again, rulers of Catholic and Protestant faith had been going on for a while. But James kept it quiet until the Test Acts came out. And at that point, he decided to resign all of his offices, including that of Lord High Admiral. He said, I am not going to take this oath. And in doing so, he basically made his conversion public. And this upset people. People were nervous and worried about this because Charles II had no legitimate heirs. So James was now the Catholic heir, and they were concerned about that. After Anne Hyde died a few years later in 1673, James married Mary of Modena. She was 15 years old, only a few years older than his daughters by his first wife. She was an Italian noblewoman and a Catholic. So he was outwardly marrying a Catholic. By now he's admitting he's a Catholic. And then 3 years later in 1676, the Pope acknowledged James as a Catholic. So now some people were really getting nervous. The Protestants and the government were really getting nervous because they just said, we don't want a Catholic monarchy. They kind of equated this in part to absolute rule, akin to that of Louis XIV in France, the Catholic king in France. During the first 9 years of their marriage, Mary gave birth to 5 children, including a son, all of whom died. So, excuse me for just 1 minute. Someone was going to pick that up and they didn't do it for me. So. Sorry about that. Someone did pick it up. I was hoping someone was going to grab that. So anyway, Mary was pregnant, gave birth to 5 children, including a son, but they all died. So there were at this point no heirs from James, but there would be a very important one later that we're going to talk about. So people are a little concerned, it looks like there might be a Catholic succession on the throne. And then this came about. This happened when Charles II was still king. In 1678, a phony conspiracy arose, and it started with this guy. He was basically a serial liar. His name was Titus Oates. And this theory came about that there was a Catholic plot in place to assassinate the king and install James on the throne. The Catholics wanted a Catholic king, so they were going to assassinate Charles II, put his brother on the throne. The House of Commons was so convinced of this, what they called a damnable and hellish plot, that they started a whole movement to exclude James II from the succession, the future James II from the succession. They said he should not be even in the line of succession to the throne. You had people on the streets who were burning the Pope in effigy. Various Catholics were actually convicted of involvement in this plot, and some were executed, even though the plot turned out to be nothing. It was a phony plot. It was a conspiracy theory. They called it the Popish plot. But there was this fierce campaign at this point to bar the then Duke of York from becoming James II at some point. They had 3 successive parliaments trying to bar him. Now, during this crisis, James went off and he was in exile in Brussels. He was in exile in Edinburgh. But Charles II, if you recall last month, we talked about the fact that he was pretty savvy. He saw what happened to his father, and Charles II was pretty good at being able to, most of the time, work with Parliament, and most of the time compromise and work with them. But in this case, he was very wedded to the idea of hereditary succession. And he said, no, I'm not going to compromise on this point. And in fact, he ended up dissolving Parliament in March of 1681. That's how he got around it. He said, no, I'm shutting down Parliament. I am not, my brother is my heir at this point. So James returns to England. As for Titus Oates, he's sent to prison. And later he died in obscurity in his 50s. There's a very interesting book about this that I will ask. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's called Hoax. It's a really interesting book about the whole Popish plot, and I will share that title with you. I'll ask the office to share that title with people later. So Charles dies, and James becomes king. Now, and this is a picture, an image from his coronation. Some historians have argued that James's conversion really had little effect on his political views. He actually, very early on, and before he was king, he worked really well with the Protestant members of Parliament. He was favorable toward the Anglican Church. He was supportive of England's getting involved in the European War on the side of the Dutch, who were Protestants. And he even agreed to the marriage of his eldest daughter, Mary, to the Protestant William of Orange in 1677. So he seemed, fairly flexible in this regard. When he came to the throne in 1685, he faced very little, at least overt, opposition. And he seemed to have, fairly strong support, even amongst the Anglicans. There were still people concerned, of course. They didn't want a Catholic king, but his position looked strong. He assured them, look, I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to change any of the religious legislation. I'm keeping everything the same. He came in with a revenue of about £2 million. So he had a healthy treasury, and he had a standing army of about 20,000 men. So he looked to be in good shape from his perspective. However, almost from the start, he ran into some political crises. And the first was this guy, James, Duke of Monmouth. Now, you might recall him when we talked about Charles I and Charles II. James was the illegitimate son of Charles II before when he was in exile, and Lucy Walter. Charles was only about 18 years old when he fathered James with Lucy Walter. He later deserted her. She claimed they were married. Charles II said they were never married, but he did recognize his son. When his son was still a child, living kind of in poverty with Lucy Walter in Europe, he actually had his son abducted from Lucy and raised and brought to court. James came to court. He was, I don't know how to say this in a nicer way, he was a spoiled brat. His father had a blind spot when it came to him. He gave him the title the Duke of Monmouth. He gave him all of these accolades. James, again, was a good military guy. He put him in charge of a lot of military operations. He lavished money on him, homes on him. He made a good marriage for him. So James was doing quite well for himself. And got a little, got to the point where he thought, no, I am the legitimate heir. He believed, or said he believed, that his parents had been married. And so he actually came and tried to invade England. He was living in France at the time, and Louis XIV supported him. Supported this when he went into exile at one point in France because he fell out with his father. And Louis said, yep, you should be the Catholic king. And there were Catholics in England who wanted him. But I mean, sorry, not Catholics, Protestants who wanted him. It wasn't Louis, I'm sorry, it was the Scots. Anyway, it was a disaster for poor James because James really played his cards badly. His army was defeated. and he was executed as a young man. So you got James II fighting with his nephew, James, Duke of Monmouth. And at the same time in Scotland, the Duke of Argyll also attempted a rebellion, but that failed. That failed as well. And what happened was these rebellions against the new James II, it made him distrust his subjects to an extent. He really started worrying about these Protestant plots, as it were. His army, which was already large, he increased it even more, and the new regiments were granted to Roman Catholic officers who had a lot of military experience in Europe. He knew that they were going to be loyal to him. He was appointing Catholics to senior military appointments. Again, this was making people a little bit nervous, despite the fact that James seemed to be, open and willing to work with everyone. They did not like this increasing Catholic presence. Then the same year, he starts to clash with Parliament. So basically, first he went to Parliament and he said, okay, he was growing his army because of these insurrections against him. And he said, I need more funding to maintain my army. And basically by now he had this large professional permanent army. And this was not really a tradition in England. During the interregnum period under Oliver Cromwell put together the New Model Army, which was for a time a permanent army, but that wasn't usually how things were done. And again, this concerned many people because they once again kind of tied this idea of permanent professional armies with autocratic rulers in France and in Spain. And many of them still had bad memories of Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army. So Parliament was not in favor of increasing funding for the military. And then James clashed with the Commons even more, because then he said, I want you to repeal the Test Acts. I want you to, shut those down. Nobody should have to take this oath. And Parliament said no. They refused to do that. So James prorogued Parliament. And so what that meant was he didn't dissolve it. He didn't get rid of them altogether. He suspended Parliament for a time being. But in truth, Parliament never reconvened. And later, we'll see James did dissolve Parliament altogether. So now he's beginning to clash heads with Parliament. He's beginning to kind of increase the Catholic presence in the military. And not only the military, he starts increasing the Catholic presence in the government. Because the following year, in 1686, he starts to have more and more problems with his former allies, the Anglican Tories that were in the government. And in April of that year, he won what looked like an apparent victory for him in this whole Test Acts controversy, because there were judges that ruled and said, okay, in individual cases, the monarch can dispense with the Test Acts without the consent of Parliament. Well, James should have known better, knowing what happened to Charles I. You don't want to go against Parliament. Why did the judges rule in his favor in this case? Well, they did so because James had dismissed judges and Lord Lieutenants who refused to support the withdrawal of this act. So he got rid of them and he replaced them with judges who would rule in his favor. So again, he looked like he was overstepping his bounds. And then he started allowing Roman Catholics into the Privy Council of his court and his government, and then high offices of state. He began letting Catholics into university positions. In July of 1686, an ecclesiastical commission was set up, and this basically derived certain clergy members of their roles in the Church of England, including Henry Compton. He was the Bishop of London, and he was stripped of his role after he refused to suspend a London clergyman who had spoken out against Roman Catholicism. So now you see James really beginning to double down in terms of Catholicism. As I said, he gave university positions to Roman Catholics. Magdalen College at Oxford was given over for the use of Roman Catholics. And a papal diplomat was officially accredited to St. James's Court, St. James's Palace. And that was the first time since Henry VIII that had happened. In April, James issued the Declaration of Indulgence. And basically this was aimed at providing religious tolerance. So again, at this point, he suspended all laws against Roman Catholics, which he said he wasn't going to do initially. But he was also extending a hand to Protestant dissidents as well, those outside of the mainline Church of England. Many Protestant nonconformists, they liked this, they liked this idea of more religious liberty for themselves. But at the same time, people in Parliament, the Protestants in Parliament, saw this as a ploy on James's part to encourage conversions to Catholicism. And they said, this is a very dangerous abuse of his power, everything he's doing. So what does James do? He dissolves Parliament. That's when he gets rid of Parliament altogether. And his idea was, I'm going to recreate a new Parliament with individuals who will agree with what I want, with my wishes. There's still debate amongst historians about what James's wishes really were, because some of what he said really did suggest a genuine belief in religious tolerance, not just for Roman Catholics, but for anybody. On the other hand, a lot of his actions suggested that he wanted to really establish Roman Catholicism as the exclusive religion of the state. I don't personally think that was the case. I personally think he was trying to be more tolerant, but I do think he was getting increasingly concerned about the divide and the fact that the Protestants kept pushing against him. In any event, we really don't know for sure. All we know is that any potential members of Parliament that James wanted to put in place were asked a series of questions to assess whether they would vote for or would support somebody who would vote for the repeal of the Test Acts and any penal laws against Catholics. So yeah, it's not putting him in a good standing at this point with his government. So we come to his last year on the throne, 1688. And at this point, there were 7 leading bishops who refused the king's orders to read the Declaration of Indulgence, to read those out in church. They were charged with seditious libel and they were arrested. Now, later, to the anger and embarrassment of James, but probably to the general relief of the public, because this is looking more and more like an autocratic ruler, all 7 of these bishops were acquitted and they were set free. And of course, James was not happy about that, but that's the way it came down. But the crisis, this whole crisis with James really came to a head in June of 1688, because his wife Mary gave birth to a son. She gave birth prematurely. She was getting up there in age. They had all these other children that died. The only people who witnessed the birth were Catholics. So once again, we have another conspiracy theory crop up. And at this point, it was very widely but falsely rumored that this baby was not a child of Mary and James's, but rather one that was smuggled into the birth room in a bed warming pan, just to make sure that there was a Catholic succession to the throne. So they had all these, suspicions because, oh, the queen was too old. They didn't have any children that lived before, that lived long. This is a phony baby. This is not their baby. Well, there was DNA analysis done, I believe, around 2012 that did indeed confirm the fact that this was their child. But what this did was this actually launched a tradition with the monarchy, and it was a practice that carried on until 1948. Where any monarch female, obviously not monarch, but I mean any female giving birth, the king's wife or a queen, that birth had to be witnessed by a government minister to make sure there wasn't a baby being smuggled in and they weren't really giving birth. This went on until 1948, until the then Princess Elizabeth, later Elizabeth II, when she was pregnant for now King Charles III. And her father put his foot down at that point. Now, at that point, you didn't have a government minister in the room actually witnessing the birth, but they'd be out in the hallway to make sure, nobody was being snuck in. And at that point, her father, King George VI, said, nope, we're getting rid of this. And they have never had it since. But it went all the way up to 1948, interestingly enough. So now James has a legitimate male heir, living male heir, who he has baptized as a Catholic. He's a Catholic, his wife is Catholic, he's populating the government Catholics. And this kind of killed any hope. So, there were a lot of Protestants in England who thought, okay, well, James has these 2 daughters. His elder daughter, Mary, is married to William of Orange over in the Netherlands. She should be his heir. She should be his heir. But now he had a male heir, and she was Protestant. Both of James's children were raised Protestants. Both of his daughters were raised Protestants. But that looked to kill any chance of her coming to the throne. So Parliament's getting more and more worried about this, and they're really worried that there's going to be this Catholic dynasty. And that leads us to the Glorious Revolution. So after the acquittal of the 7 bishops I mentioned earlier, a group of noblemen who were dubbed the Immortal Seven, they were not these 7 bishops, they just happened to be 7 as well. They sent a letter to William of Orange. And again, Dutch Protestant, married to James's daughter, Mary. William was also Mary's first cousin. William's mother was a sister of Charles I, so he had strong bloodlines too to the English throne. But they wrote and they said, look, come on over, bring an army with you. We want to call a free parliament, and we want this parliament to arbitrate on the legitimacy of this son of James and Mary. Now, William had been encouraged to invade England twice before, but he refused both times. But this time he said, okay, I'll come. And he came over in November of 1688. James initially thought, this is no problem. I can take this guy, I can take him down. This is not going to be a problem. And in fact, Louis XIV over in France is like, look, I'll send you troops to help fight William of Orange. And James is like, no, that's okay. I've got this. Well, James was deluded. He didn't have it. And indeed, he was defeated. His armies actually deserted. The Protestants and his armies, when they saw the way the wind was blowing, started going over to the other side. His other daughter, Princess Anne, his younger daughter, she also pretty much defected to the Protestant cause. She was a Protestant anyway. So it was a short revolution. There were just a couple of minor skirmishes. James's regime collapsed totally. Very few casualties, no real major battles. So it was very, very short. Meanwhile, James's wife, Mary, and his infant son flee to France. And once he realized everything's lost, I'm not going to win this, James himself tried to flee to France. And during that time, he took with him the Great Seal. And the Great Seal, you had to have this. No lawful parliament could be summoned without it. So he took the Great Seal with him and he threw it in the Thames. But he was captured by fishermen while he was trying to escape, brought back. But only 12 days later, the government pretty much allowed him to escape to France. They didn't want another execution of a monarch on their hands like they had had with Charles I. They just wanted this guy out of their hair, basically. So they're like, go to France. So James went to France. He joined his wife and son there. He set up a court in exile. He was befriended. Well, he was already befriended, but I mean, he set up a court in exile and had support from Louis XIV. And then he tried once to come back. He did try to come back and kind of invade again, but that was kind of a disaster. He did not succeed in that case. So he ended up being permanently in exile in France. When he died, Louis XIV actually proclaimed his son, James's son, James Edward Stuart, King of England. And he said, no, he is the rightful King of England. So Louis was still supporting this Catholic dynasty, a possible dynasty in England. And we'll talk more about that next month when we get to the Georgians, because James Stuart will come back and cause some problems later on. But for now, that's what happened with James II. He did not lose his head, luckily, like his father did, but he did end up in exile for the rest of his life. And as an aside, that Test Acts that he was trying to repeal for so long, the Test Acts, they were not repealed until the introduction of the Catholic Relief Act in 1829. So it was quite some time before they were repealed. So now that leads us to William and Mary. Now, there were some who really weren't too happy about having William as king. They actually invited William to come invade, but they sort of wanted Mary to be the monarch. She was obviously the daughter of James II, and she was a Protestant. And she had a very obviously legitimate connection to the throne, but she said, no, I will not come unless my husband rules with me. So William, he didn't really speak English, very little English. They weren't crazy about the idea, but they're like, okay, he did kick this guy out for us. He's married to Mary. So they said, okay, a parliament was called, and they said, okay, they offered the throne to both William and Mary jointly. This made them more or less the first real joint monarchs in England, the only joint monarchs in England. And I say more or less, because in Tudor times, Henry VIII's daughter, his elder daughter, Mary, she came to the throne as the monarch on her own, but shortly thereafter, she married Philip of Spain. And now Mary I was a Catholic, Philip was a Catholic, unpopular marriage with the people, because again, you're bringing in a foreigner, and he was King Philip, so he kind of jointly ruled with her. Their coins were issued together with both their faces on there. But the difference is, when Mary I died, Philip took off. And actually, Philip didn't spend that much time in England to begin with. He still spent most of his time in Spain, but he took off. Whereas in this case, as we'll see, with William and Mary, when Mary II died, William remained king. He remained king. So it really was the first joint monarchy. Oh, the really interesting thing for England about this was when Parliament formally made the offer of the crown to William and Mary, it also presented them with something called the Declaration of Rights. And this was a statement of the rights of subjects, and particularly the liberties of Parliament. So it spelled out how frequently you should be having parliaments meet, freedom of speech, and because they said, James infringed these rights, Charles I before him infringed these rights. And this is you can see, this is from the British Library, a piece of that document, an image of that document. So, but contrary to popular belief, Parliament did not present the declaration to William and Mary as a condition that they had to accept to be made king and queen. They did not do that. But in reality, the rights affirmed in the declaration took statutory effect in December of 1689, after William and Mary came to the throne with their assent, with royal assent. And it was passed as an act of Parliament, which is now called the Bill of Rights, basically. So they recognized the power of Parliament, and there was a revised oath written for their coronation. And so at their coronation, they had to swear to govern by the statutes in Parliament agreed on, instead of by the laws and customs granted by the kings of England. So they were giving more power to Parliament. The declaration said it was illegal for the crown to suspend or dispense with the law. The crown could not levy money without parliamentary assent, so they couldn't tax people, and they couldn't raise an army in peacetime without Parliament's assent, and that they had to exercise due process in any criminal trials. So in many ways, this Bill of Rights, we all know about the Magna Carta, a lot of people know about the Magna Carta and how important that was, but this Bill of Rights really was the foundation for constitutional monarchy in the UK. So that was one big thing that came out of their reign. Now, William, when they first came to the throne, William was very busy, engaged in the 9 Years' War, overseeing, England's part in the 9 Years' War, which was yet another European war. I'm not going to go into it here, but it was between France and what they called the Grand Alliance. Louis XIV had invaded part of the Rhineland, and then this kicked off this whole thing, and England took the side of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Empire, and Spain got involved, and the Dutch got involved. Anyway, William was engaged with that. Mary was more or less ruling on her own for a time, although taking a lot of advice from her husband. She really wasn't that keen on being a ruler on her own, which is why she wanted him there to begin with. But what else besides the Bill of Rights came out of their reign? Well, again, because we have so little time, I can't go into every detail, but something maybe not quite as important as the Bill of Rights, but still interesting, was Kensington Palace, if you've been to Kensington Palace. So in addition to furthering parliamentary democracy, William and Mary gave the country Kensington Palace, and it's still a royal residence to this day. The Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Kate, have an apartment there, apartment in quotes, 4 stories, about 25 rooms. And how this came to be was King William suffered from ill health, particularly asthma. And at this time, the principal palace royal residence in London was Whitehall Palace. And that was right in the heart of London. London was polluted, the air wasn't great. So William and Mary said, we're going to move our court out to Hampton Court Palace, another royal residence. But that's about, I think, 16 miles maybe from London, which now doesn't sound like much, but back in that day, was a bit of a hike. And the government was kind of concerned and like, you know, we really don't want you permanently out there. It's going to be hard. You're going to be inaccessible. It's going to be hard to carry out official business. So they compromised and they said, okay, they found this place in Kensington, which at that time was west of London, rural, wasn't part of London, but still very close, much closer than Hampton Court. So it was owned by the Earl of Nottingham. So they bought it and they transformed the Earl's mansion into this palace. They engaged Sir Christopher Wren, he of St. Paul's Cathedral, and they said, expand this place for us, put in official state apartments, put in a chapel, more accommodations for our court, additional kitchens, stables. So built this palace. Queen Mary largely oversaw the work. That's what she enjoyed doing, interior design and gardening and sort of overseeing that. And they got it up and running pretty fast. And she and William, they lavishly entertained when they lived there. They had balls, they had drawing rooms, they had gambling parties that went long into the night. So they had some happy times there. But they also did spend time out at Hampton Court. And so they also commissioned Christopher Wren and they said, look, we want to renovate this old Tudor palace. And originally, Christopher Wren was going to knock the whole Tudor palace down and start from scratch. Luckily, he didn't do that. So today, what we have is on the left here, if you've been out there, that's the entrance, the entrance into Hampton Court, and it is Tudor splendor. But what he did do was he did renovate part of it, and he created the very spectacular fountain court, this kind of Baroque architecture that you can see on the right here. So it's a blending of both. You get a bit of both, and you know, quite a bit of the original Tudor palace luckily remained intact. So that was another thing that happened under their reign. And then finally, closer to home, William and Mary College, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So back in February of 1693, William and Mary signed a charter for a perpetual college of divinity, philosophy, languages, and other good arts and sciences to be established in the Virginia colony and known as the College of William and Mary in Virginia. So we do have a US connection with William and Mary. So in 1694, when she was only 32 years old, Queen Mary died of smallpox. As I said, William continued to reign on his own until his death in 1702, but William and Mary had no children. So at this point, the crown passed to Mary's sister Anne. Anne was the second daughter of James II and his first wife, Anne Hyde. And when she was born in 1665, it wasn't expected that she was going to become queen. So her education was more suitable for domestic life. There was no thought that she would ever make it to the throne. And as I said before, although James II was Catholic, converted to Catholicism, at the insistence of his brother, Charles II, both Mary and Anne were raised as Protestants. Now, when Anne was only 6 years old, her mother died. Anne was a very quiet, shy child. Some people said she was a little lazy, not all that interested in really working, if you will, but she was lacking in confidence, quiet, she was shy. She had ill health a lot of her life. But despite her natural shyness, after she came to the throne, she was said to be a really good public speaker. Her first speech to Parliament, she emphasized her own English heritage. This may have been a knock at her brother-in-law, William. She didn't get along all that well with her brother-in-law and her sister. So she emphasized, I'm English. And she also included her commitment to a Protestant succession. She was a very devout Protestant, Anne was. And although she was poorly educated for a future queen, she did display a genuine interest in the politics of the day. Now, England at this time was getting really politically polarized between two parties, the Whigs and the Tories, and I'm going to talk about them in a couple of minutes. So she was very interested in the politics of the day. She attended the House of Lords regularly. She met daily with her ministers, and she was very good at trying to navigate these kind of rival political views that were really dominating Parliament at this time because of these two parties. She pursued moderation as a political strategy, and she knew that this was also a necessary tactic at a time of war because there were two wars going on. during her reign, and there were conflicting and competing political viewpoints about these wars. So war on two fronts: Queen Anne's War, which was from 1702 to 1714. This was the second of 4 wars that were fought between Great Britain and France in North America. And basically it was for control of the continent. And this conflict erupted when, with the backing of indigenous allies, the French carried out a series of attacks on English settlements on the New England frontier. And then the fighting spread, and it made it all the way down to the Carolinas, where you had English colonists in the Carolinas attacking Spanish territories and going into Florida and attacking. The English did try to invade Quebec in 1710. They failed, but they did manage to capture a very important French fortress, Port Royal, and they did manage to then gain what's now Nova Scotia. And then later, under a treaty in 1713, Britain acquired Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay region. So they kind of came out of that okay overall. The second war that they were engaged in was the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, there were always wars going, and I'm making kind of light of this. Like I said, we don't have that much time to talk about this, but always wars, always fighting and factions going on in Europe. So the War of the Spanish Succession, that was a conflict that arose out of the disputed succession to the throne of Spain following the death of Charles II, not Charles II of England, but Charles II, who was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. And he was childless, so he had no heirs. So this was a struggle to determine whether this vast amount of territory in the Spanish Empire, should this go to the House of Bourbon or to the House of Habsburg. Both of them had dynastic claims. So there was a debate over where this was supposed to fall, and England sided with the Spanish in this conflict. So 2 wars going on at the same time, and the government fighting about it, because the Tories were on one side of supporting it, the Whigs were on the other side, whether they wanted to support it or not. And we'll come back to them again in a minute. Meanwhile, in 1683, before Anne, this is before she's queen, this is when she's still princess. Her sister's still alive, or her brother-in-law still alive. She married Prince George of Denmark. And you can see him on the left here. He was said to be a very dull man, but she loved him. So even though, like all royal marriages, this one was politically based, it was said that Anne and George really had a very close and loving relationship. And in fact, she was pregnant any place between 16 and 18 times. We're not sure. But between 1683 and 1700, she was pregnant at least 16 to 18 times. Most of the pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only 5 of the children were born alive. For poor Anne, years and years of pregnancy took their toll on her. Her health got even worse. By the time she reached her 30s, she was gout-ridden. She was very obese. She could barely walk without assistance. Of those 5 children, only 1 survived beyond infancy, and that was William, Duke of Gloucester, the young man you see here on the right. He was born at Hampton Court Palace on the 24th of July in 1689. But when he was only 11 years old in 1700, he died of smallpox. So Anne had no heirs. Her sister had died, obviously. So William III had no heirs. So suddenly you've got no confirmed Protestant heir sitting there to the throne. So this led to the Act of Settlement of 1701. And this was to ensure that any future sovereigns remained within the Protestant faith. It was to secure the Protestant succession. So they went back. There were about 52 possible Catholic Stuart heirs to the throne. But they went back and they ended up going over to Hanover in what is now Germany. And the throne was said to, once Anne was gone, once William was gone and Anne was gone, the throne was going to go to Princess Sophia, who was the Electress of Hanover. She was James I's granddaughter. So again, there was a bloodline there. They weren't making this up. And they said, okay, so it's going to go to her and any of her Protestant heirs. That's how the succession is going to roll out from now on. But Sophia died before Queen Anne. So the succession passed to her son, George, who in 1714 became King George I, launching the Georgian dynasty, which we'll talk about next month. This act of settlement also reinforced the Bill of Rights. So it strengthened the mandate that the government had undertaken, that, okay, government is ruled by, the country is ruled by the government along with the sovereign, but, the sovereign had to work with his or her ministers. It couldn't be just the sovereign and any personal advisors they wanted. Parliamentary consent had to be given, again, for the sovereign to leave the country or engage in a war. All the things, they just reinforced everything that was in that Bill of Rights before. But it also laid down the conditions under which the crown could be held. So I said the whole point of this was to secure a Protestant succession. So they laid out no Roman Catholic, nor anyone married to a Roman Catholic could hold the crown. So the sovereign now had to swear to maintain the Church of England. We even saw this with Charles III's coronation. He gave an oath to defend the Protestant faith. And it wasn't until 2015 that a member of the royal family, including the monarch, could marry a Roman Catholic without losing his or her place in the line of succession. 2015. So had Prince Charles, had Catherine Middleton, Prince Charles's wife, the Princess of Wales, had she been a Catholic, Prince Charles would have been off the line of succession. He would have been off the line of succession. And to this day, a Roman Catholic is still barred from succeeding to the throne. So if Prince Charles suddenly gets it in his mind that he wants to be a Catholic, he's no longer in succession to the throne. So some of that stuff is still carrying over, interestingly enough, to this day. Okay, so got to talk about a couple of other things in Anne's reign. When she was around 10 years old, the future Queen Anne met this woman at the time, a 15-year-old named Sarah Jennings. She met her at the court of Anne's father, who was still the Duke of York at that time. He had made Sarah a maid-in-waiting to his wife. Now, as I said before, Anne was very insecure. She was very withdrawn, introverted. But she was very attracted to this older, more self-confident and outgoing young woman. Although Sarah herself once remarked that she'd rather be in a dungeon, in quotes, than in conversation with Anne, whom she found boring, Sarah Jennings was savvy enough to know the worth of befriending Anne, basically. And one of Queen Anne's biographers, Anne Somerset, wrote that Sarah admitted that she cultivated the relationship with great care and now began to employ all her wit, all her vivacity, and almost all of her time to divert and entertain and serve the princess. And it paid off really well, because Sarah was made a lady of the bedchamber after Anne's marriage in 1683. Sarah was very attractive. She was intelligent, very ambitious, and obviously very politically and personally calculating. She also had a really biting wit, and she had a cruel streak. She's not a person I think I would have liked very much. She was known to be very condescending to and critical of Anne, even after she was queen, while Sarah was serving her. And when Anne was crowned queen in 1702, Sarah's star rose even further. She was named Mistress of the Robes. You can't get closer to the monarch than that. Basically, you got a key to their bedroom. You've got unparalleled access to the monarch at this point. She was also made keeper of the privy purse. So she really held a lot of power. Anne idolized Sarah. Sarah was everything she wanted to be, basically. She felt so strongly about her. She commissioned some portraits of her, and she adopted nicknames. So when they wrote back and forth, Sarah was often gone from court. She was married at this time. She was often away from court. And when she was away from court, Anne, demanded, "You've got to write to me." But she made up nicknames for them. So Anne said, "I'm Mrs. Morley and you're Mrs. Freeman," which sounds silly. But in reality, what that means is when Sarah was writing to her sovereign, she wasn't writing to Your Majesty, she was writing to Mrs. Morley. She was on equal footing with these titles, with the Queen. And she tried to exert as much influence over Anne as she could. She really acted as Anne's gatekeeper. She decided who could have access to the monarch, and this gave her more and more political power. Sarah's husband, John, Sarah and John were both committed Whigs. The Whig Party had a kind of a firm hold in government in the early years of Anne's reign, even though Anne was more sympathetic to the Tories. And again, I'll talk about these two parties in a minute. So Sarah was also trying to exert political influence over Anne about Whig policies. And of course, Sarah's husband, John Churchill, benefited very much from his wife's close association with the Queen. Once Anne became Queen, John Churchill was quickly appointed as Captain General of the Forces, Master General of the Ordnance. Later, he was created Duke of Marlborough. But Anne had to pay Sarah and John to take that title because Sarah and John said, we can't afford that. We can't afford the lifestyle that comes with being a Duke and Duchess. So she spilled out more money for them. Now, Churchill was an outstanding military figure of his day. I'm not trying to say that he was handed this stuff totally for free. In 1704, during the War of the Spanish Succession, he led Allied forces to victory in the Battle of Blenheim. And again, handsomely rewarded by the Queen and Parliament for this. But he was a very astute and very good military man, but definitely gained by his marriage. So let me talk a little bit about the Whigs and the Tories without boring you too much with politics here. So one of the most significant developments in political life during the later Stuarts was the growth of these really clearly defined and opposing parties. And they took the titles Whigs and Tories. And it was getting pretty fractious, kind of like we're seeing with the Democrats and Republicans here. Now, originally, Whig and Tory, these were terms of abuse that came about during the debate over this bill to exclude the future James II from the succession. Remember, I mentioned that Parliament did not want him to succeed. That's when these terms first came up. And originally, these two groups were pretty loosely defined. But over time, they became more clearly recognizable political parties. And by the time we get to the end of the reign of William III, they're very, very strongly recognized as two separate parties. So the Whigs, the Scottish term Whig, there's some debate about this. It is said to come from Whigamore, which was a member of a band of these inhabitants of the southwestern part of Scotland. In 1648, they marched to Edinburgh to oppose the king. This was also a title that was a term that was sometimes used to describe horse thieves in Scotland. And basically, Whig policy sought to limit royal authority and increase parliamentary power. That's putting it very, very quick, that's the quick and dirty version of this. So they really defended Parliament's rights to determine the succession to the throne. They also they were tolerant of some dissenting religious views, and they backed the financial interests of wealthy middle class and aristocracy and land-owning families. So that's where they were coming from, and that's where the Churchills were, the Marlboroughs were. And they did push Anne to support some Whig interests. And the Whigs also were in favor of these wars that were going on, these European wars. So they pushed for these expensive and kind of aggressive foreign policies that were going on. This wasn't always popular with people because these wars were expensive and they were funded by tax, right? And in the early years, except for a few battles in the early years, their successes were few and far between. So that was not a popular policy. But they were responsible for creating a union with Scotland, the Act of Union of 1707. And this came about after Scotland said, we are not going to accept this Hanoverian succession. We are not going to accept this Act of Settlement that you guys came up with saying you're going to bring the Hanoverians over once Queen Anne is dead, once Anne is dead. They did not want to accept that. So as a response, something called the Alien Act of 1705 was set up. And basically, this prohibited all trade between England and Scotland. And Scotland said, this is going to be economically disastrous for us. We can't have this. So Scottish leaders negotiated, and they said, okay, let's set up a permanent union with England, and that will see free trade established. We want protection for Scottish Presbyterianism, for our religion up here, and we want protection for our own Scottish legal system. And they included, we want to have 45 Scottish members in the English House of the Commons, and we want to have 18 members in the House of Lords. That all happened. And for their part, what did England gain? Well, they gained security on their northern border, and they also gained the promise of a peaceful Hanoverian succession. The Scots said, we won't fight this, we'll go along with this. So those are who the Whigs were. The Tories, for their part, this was an Irish term that came from the word for a dispossessed Irishman subsiding on as an outlaw, basically, came out of the 17th century. They favored the Stuarts. They favored royal authority and hereditary succession. They didn't think that Parliament should be deciding the succession. They thought that should be down to the monarch. That said, they were somewhat divided over Hanoverian succession, because they kind of hoped that James II's exiled son might convert to Protestantism and come back. That was not going to happen. They opposed expensive foreign land wars, so they really opposed the wars that were going on. And although they had a majority in Commons, in the Commons for a while, and Anne actually favored them. Queen Anne favored them. For the first half of her reign, Whig policies were really dominant, and in part because of the influence of Sarah Churchill, in part. But the Tories gained greater power throughout Anne's reign, particularly when Sarah and her husband started falling out of favor with Queen Anne, and they finally won control in 1710. And it was them taking control that ended these wars, that got Britain out of these wars that we saw. Okay, very, very quickly, because we're running out of time. Over time, Queen Anne grew really tired of Sarah's domination. In 1704, Sarah's cousin, Abigail Hill, entered Anne's court just as a bedchamber woman. So she was just helping the queen dress in the morning, changing her bandages, nothing fancy. But where Sarah had been very domineering and politically minded, Abigail was said to be more gentle, more kind, more compassionate. Abigail was a Tory, and we believe she may have, nudged Anne a little that way. Anne didn't need much nudging because Anne did side with the Tories. But Abigail was a quieter, more soothing presence. Now, at this time, Sarah had been away from court for quite a while. And she was very shocked when she discovered in 1707 just how close Queen Anne and Abigail had become. Queen Anne had actually been one of the few witnesses at Abigail's secret wedding to a gentleman of her household, of the queen's household. And when Abigail married, Anne gave her a dowry from the privy purse. And this really upset Sarah, because Sarah said, wait a minute, I'm the keeper of the privy purse. How dare you? She saw this as a betrayal on her part. So where Sarah and her husband used their influence to promote Whig policies, Abigail tried to do so in a quieter manner for the other side. Sarah is seeing her power slip away. She's becoming increasingly desperate in her attempts to regain favor. She was plotting strategies with her husband to oust Abigail. She threatened blackmail, and she even stirred up rumors that the queen's relationship with Abigail was a sexual one. And in this way, Sarah went to the queen, unbelievably, and threatened to release letters that Anne had written to her decades earlier when they were girls, basically. And in these letters, Anne had demonstrated her affection towards Sarah, and she used language such as, if I writ whole volumes, I could never express how well I love you, unimaginably, passionately, affectionately yours. Now, if you look at these letters of this time period, any letters that young women were writing to each other at this time period, if we apply a 21st century lens to this wording, it would be very easy to infer that Sarah and Anne may have had a sexual, or that Anne had sexual feelings for Sarah, right? But at that time, platonic relationships between young women often employed this very strong, emotional, emotive language. That's just how they wrote. And we do know that Anne adored Sarah, but maybe she had what we would call a schoolgirl crush on her, but that doesn't mean there was anything sexual about it. But nonetheless, Sarah went so far as to pull out some of these sentences, and she threatened Anne. She said, such things are in my power that if known, might lose a crown. So she was actually trying to blackmail the queen. Relations between Sarah and Anne grew steadily worse, and really came to a head when Sarah publicly insulted Anne at Westminster Abbey. They had an argument, I believe, before going into the church over the fact that Sarah wanted Anne to wear certain jewels that Anne didn't wear. And at one point, Sarah yelled at the queen, be quiet. You don't do that to your sovereign. So once they fell out, Sarah's comments were even more harsh. So immediately after the death of Queen Anne's husband in 1708, when Prince George died, Sarah said, although Anne's love to the prince seemed to be prestigiously great, her stomach was greater. For that very day he died, she ate 3 very large and hearty meals. Really nasty, not nice stuff at all. I mean, that's really cruel, really cruel. And of course, she's poking fun at the fact that the queen was also very heavy. So Anne finally has enough. She dismisses Sarah from court, and she asks her for the return of Sarah's gold key of the royal bedchamber, the keys she had all this access to. And this again was a symbol of Sarah's power, of her station, of her access to the sovereign. So what does Sarah do? In retaliation, she takes 18,000 pounds from the privy purse, stole it, basically. And reportedly, we don't know this for a fact, but it makes a nice little rumor. Reportedly, she removed the brass locks from every door in St. James's Palace that her key would have fit to. Supposedly, she took all those locks. Now, were there any sexual relationships between Abigail and Sarah? Or did Anne have feelings? I'm sorry, Abigail and Anne. Or did Anne have feelings, sexual feelings for Sarah? Of course, we don't know that for a given, but it seems highly, highly unlikely that there were any sexual relationships between the queen and either of these favorites of hers. There were many factors because of this. Look, she was pregnant all the time. She had between 16 and 18 pregnancies. She was in very poor health. She had a very strong sense of Christian morality. She was quite a strong Christian. And she shared a bed regularly with her husband. They shared a room, unlike most monarchs. So it seems very, very unlikely. Now, after Sarah was dismissed from Anne's court, Abigail did replace her as the keeper of the privy purse. Abigail's husband was given a peerage, but having been dominated once before, Anne was more cautious when it came to Abigail. She didn't give her as much leeway. She didn't give her as much authority and power in the end. The Churchills went on. They had a long, happy, successful marriage. They fell in and out of favor with the monarchs over time. They went into exile for a while in Europe, but then they came back later. Sarah lived a very, very long life. She wrote her memoirs in which she really smeared Queen Anne in her memoirs. Quite an interesting woman in and of herself, I should say. Okay, so, and if you saw the film, The Favorite, which was entertaining, but about as unauthentic as could possibly be, but very entertaining and very well acted. Here's a still from that film, and you've got Olivia Colman as Queen Anne, and sitting at her feet disgruntled is Sarah Churchill, and sitting on her lap, dressed in men's clothing, which never really happened, was Abigail. And all the little rabbits were meant to be replacements for all the children that Anne lost. Anne did not have 18 rabbits in her court. But anyway, Anne died at Kensington Palace at the age of 49 after having a series of strokes. She is buried in Westminster Abbey in the Stuart vault. I don't have a picture of the actual vault. It's not exactly a fancy vault. Alongside, but this is a drawing that was done, I think, back in the 1800s, alongside her uncle, Charles II, her sister and brother-in-law, her husband, and some of her children. And with Anne's death, that leads us to the Georgians, who we're going to talk about next month, because that act of settlement came into place. The Electress Sophia was already dead at this point. So the succession passed to her son, George, who became George I of England. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen. Again, as always, that's just a drive-by view. Let's see, stop share. There we go. That's a quick overview of talking a little bit about the later Stuarts. So, oh, and I should say the other book that I will recommend, in addition to the one about the Popish plot called Hoax, is actually an excellent biography of James, Duke of Monmouth, which was quite fascinating and talked a lot about his involvement with James II and trying to overthrow James II and being the son of Charles II. Quite an interesting book. So I'll share that title as well, if Leslie doesn't mind sending that out to participants. I'll give you both of those book titles. So questions, comments, thoughts?
I just say there's another book. It's the 4-volume biography of. No, I'm not. 4-volume biography of by Winston Churchill of his great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Oh, yes, 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 indeed. Yeah, that's a very good one. I can send that along as well. Yeah. I'll send that. That's a hefty one, but yes. Yeah, if you want to know more about that whole side, the Churchills, absolutely. There's a lot to mine there in that family. Fascinating family, for sure.
And I think John Churchill was one of the instrumentalists in turning James II's army around to William of
Battle
Orange.
of the Boyne. Yep, Battle of the Boyne. Yep, absolutely. Yeah,
Well, even when they when
William was Battle of the Boyne. Sorry, yeah, yeah.
Even with James II's army dissipated, that I think John Churchill changed sides in that, and that was
John Churchill was very politically wily and savvy. He knew what was best for him, so he did. He would play both sides when he needed to. So that's why he kind of went in and out. He would side with one, then side with the other. He was very astute to his benefit. Sometimes to his detriment, but it turned out okay for him pretty much in the end. Oh, I see a hand up there. Yes. Oh,
you're muted, Priscilla.
Yes, you're
I
muted.
just did it. So this, like the Stanleys, I'm rereading some favorite historical novels about the Tudors. So like the Stanley family.
Yeah, yeah.
Say. Anyway, thank you especially for that Whig and Tory outline. I have always been so puzzled by that. Just, it's not like I haven't worked hard at it, but I hadn't been able to infer that much. Is there something, are there some good articles to read about, read about that?
I can definitely search some things out and give those to Leslie to send along as an overview. Yeah, because that was very quick. That was a 2-second quick and dirty. Here's the difference.
Right.
In fact, it's interesting because over time, they kind of switched philosophies a little bit. They kind of traded our philosophy. Yeah.
That's right. That's not my impression. Of course, now there's no Whigs. It's labor and Tories, labor and conservative, labor and Tories. Okay, thank you.
And we had Whigs and Tories in the early Republic here too. In the early.
Right, they did. Yeah.
But yeah, they did kind of, philosophies kind of shifted over time. But yeah, I'll find some stuff too.
But both names having their origin in outcasts, which is very interesting.
That was very, and one Scottish and one Irish.
Right. Thanks, Deb.
Sure. Yes, Leslie.
I have a comment and a question. Comment is, I think there can be a difference between romantic attraction or love and sexual attraction.
Yeah,
but that would be interesting to think about.
Yeah.
But my question is, all these children that have died, was it the same statistically for the general population, or was there something like what did all these kids die of, these children die of, and was that true for everybody else?
I mean, smallpox, there were all kinds of, disease was rampant then. Smallpox was a big one, dysentery. In terms of the general population, the life expectancy was quite low for children, even going up into the Victorian era, basically. And when you look at the monarchy, particularly, there were people in general population who lost children all the time and had multiple births.
Right.
But now Anne was kind of off the scales. I mean, 16, 18 pregnancies.
Yeah.
A lot of pregnancies. But of course, there was also this pressure to have an heir.
Right.
In a way that the general population, although they needed their own heirs for their own reasons, not the same type of pressure that the monarchy was under. What I always found fascinating, and I haven't really dug into this because really, as many of you know, my real expertise is the Tudor period. So we're getting into the later Stuarts here, which is still something I studied, but I mean, my background was really the Tudors. One thing I do find really fascinating is the fact that people like Charles II had, what did I say, 16 illegitimate children? I think? 12, 16 illegitimate children. And yet his wife he had no children with his wife.
Mm,
James II had illegitimate children. He did end up having children with his wife, but I mean, a lot of them died, so it's interesting to me that some of them have these successful pregnancies, living pregnancies in many cases, children who grew up. And in fact, Charles II, he acknowledged, as he did with James, Duke of Monmouth, I mean, he spoiled that kid rotten, let's face it. I mean, it kind of came back to bite him in some ways, or came back to bite his son. But he acknowledged all of his illegitimate children. He ennobled them, he gave them titles. In James's case, he gave them a lot, James got a lot out of it. James was practically royal, living at court, having apartments at court. But yeah, I always found it interesting that they have all these illegitimate children who would grow, many of whom would grow up, but there were often failed pregnancies or no pregnancies, and with their legal spouses, which I thought was kind of interesting.
yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but you're right about the romantic love thing, and that's why I said the schoolgirl crush.
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
crush on somebody and go, oh God, I love this person.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
it doesn't mean it's carried out in a sexual
Right.
manner. Yeah.
Mhm.
Other thoughts or questions? Okay, so
Thank you so much, Deb.
oh, no problem. Next month we will
You,
look
Deb.
at those Hanoverians as they come over, and we will see how James II's not warming pan baby, whose baby was not smuggled in a warming pan, how he comes back to stir up some trouble, and how his successors come back to stir up some trouble for the Georgians. So we will take a look at all of that. Again, in 1 hour, I'm squeezing in a lot of history in 1 hour. So if you have questions after the fact, if you think of something else, let Leslie know. She can pass them on to me. If you want more detailed information on any of this, because it's quick and dirty, I'm happy to share more information if you want that as well, if you want to dig deeper into anything else, or just she can pass questions along to me, and I'm happy to answer any of those that I can as well. So thank you for taking your afternoon again to sit here and listen to me. Next month, Georgians, and then in August, we're getting away from the monarchs and actually talking about something fun. We're talking, not that I don't think the monarchs are fun, I do. We are talking about royal hounds because it's the International Day of the Dog in mid-August, and I thought it might be fun to look at some of the royal pets, mostly hounds, but they had other pets as well, through history. So we'll be doing that in August, just as something kind of light and fun to end the summer on. So thanks very much. See
Thank
everybody
you.
soon. Thanks for
Bye.
coming. Yep. Bye-bye.